Hello and welcome to the Reorg, the S&I podcast where we go into the Nakamoto Institute archives, take a deep dive, and re-examine the ideas after years of accumulated proof of work. My name is Michael Goldstein, otherwise known as Bitstein, and joining me is my co-host Pierre Rochard. Pierre, how are you today?
Doing very well. How are you, Michael?
I'm doing really well as well. Lots of wells. So we are continuing our journey through the S&I mempool crash course, which was, primarily written between 2013 and 2015, and going back through this and trying to, just see what our argument was for why Bitcoin was the best monetary technology and why, because being the best monetary technology, we thought that it would manage to supersede fiat and precious metals as the dominant currency. And we just wrapped up, a few episodes talking basically about your articles regarding the monetary policy of Bitcoin. And now we're moving into some additional ideas. And today we're going to be looking mostly at proof of work and the concept of proof of work. So, in the crash course, we say Bitcoin brilliantly uses the concept of proof of work to create consensus in the network. From this, a vision of the future could develop, which in turn gave Bitcoin's real market value. So we are looking today at an article by Daniel Krawisz from 2013. This was June 24th, 2013. And I forgot to look up what the price was for that day, but if I had to guess, it was probably in the $80 range or so, or $100, somewhere in that range. That was after we had seen Bitcoin go to $250 for the first time ever in the spring of 2013, which was a very exciting time, especially because we had just gotten really into Bitcoin. So we came in just in time to experience an awesome bull market, which I think, as you've pointed out, that's a great way to get excited about Bitcoin. It's just like it's there ready to prime you with excitement and optimism. So it came down, but it came down to a price much higher than it had been. So $80 is and $100 is way more than, maybe $10 or so when we were having our first Mises Circle discussions about Bitcoin. And yeah, so this was an early attempt to try to explain proof of work, which for me, and I'd be interested to hear what your experience was. I feel like proof of work was one of the tougher things to wrap my head around. It was very easy for me to understand digital signatures and stuff like that, but actually understanding mining and how the network manages to come to consensus was very difficult. And typically when I'm talking to new people, I have my ways of explaining proof of work and how mining works, but I usually actually try to ask them to kind of forget about it until we get further into Bitcoin, because it is, kind of necessarily a more technical topic, and it's easier to just kind of assume it as a solved problem. Let's see where we can go if we assume it's a solved problem. And then once we've gotten into it a bit and we understand how Bitcoin otherwise works, then going back into it and looking at, well, we shouldn't assume that works. That's the whole point, is to not assume. But now we can actually sort of dive into it. So I usually don't treat it as a beginner topic. And, for us, especially at a time when there's hardly anything to make sense of proof of work, this was an attempt to try to put together the ideas. What was your experience with mining and trying to understand Bitcoin?
Yeah, great question. So as you pointed out, I kind of just assumed that it was a solved problem, kind of just a black box that works. Did not care about it at all and did not dig into it until I joined Riot, really, 3 years ago. So, I went almost a decade in Bitcoin without really doing a deep dive on proof of work, because from an economic perspective, beyond just the fact that, you're adding units to the ledger, it wasn't an interesting topic to me. And that the only reason why, I felt like I had to do a deep dive on proof of work was one, to be able to essentially argue against proof of stake. I think that was the best reason to do a deep dive on proof of work. And then also just to be able to explain it to others who are interested in it, because, there's lots of different psyches, archetypes of personalities around Bitcoin. And some people are just obsessed with this, more power to them. But that was not my experience.
I actually have found over the years that mining is one of the very first things that people tend to ask about, which makes it more troublesome because it's like, oh, well, there's so much to cover and you just wanted to go straight for the most difficult one. So yeah, it's not easy. I think this was a very admirable attempt to make sense of it in 2013, and I think I think there's going to be a lot here that we can say positively and sort of not even necessarily negatively, but just where maybe some metaphors aren't as strong now that we can understand some of the nuances of how the network works. So I think this will be a very interesting discussion. So let's get started. The search. Perhaps the least intuitive aspect of the Bitcoin network is the proof of work concept it uses to define the requirement for the generation of a new set of transactions, a block, to be added to the distributed transaction database, the blockchain. This concept, which grew out of the ideas from the early cypherpunk movement, is new to monetary theory and feels a little out of place in computer science too. I will show that biology gives us the most suitable framework for understanding it. All the blocks in the Bitcoin blockchain have a short string of meaningless data, called a nonce, attached to them. The mining computers are required to search for the right meaningless string such that the block as a whole satisfies a certain arbitrary condition. Specifically, it is required that the SHA-256 hash of the block has a certain number of leading zeros. Hashes are one-way functions, so there is no easy way to find the right nonce or otherwise engineer a block to be correct. The only known way to find a good nonce is to simply try randomly until one turns out to work. Khan Academy provides a visual explanation of proof of work, which, by the way, that is pretty cool that Khan Academy actually made some cool technical videos on Bitcoin very early on. And I haven't watched them since, but I remember at the time they were actually quite useful.
Yeah, the only problem I think in that paragraph really is the number of leading zeros. So that was my understanding as well until I actually looked at the code. It looks at the total numeric value and not just the leading number of zeros. So slight nuance there, but you're trying to get a total value that is less than the target, and the total you also would compare it to the total value of an alternative block as well, if both are under the target.
So if you got a block, let's say you have two blocks that you're looking at, they came in at the same time. Both passed the difficulty requirement. That's saying you need at least 50 zeros at the beginning, whatever the number is, and you're saying that after the code is looking basically which one has more zeros after that as well.
Well, it's not just so you actually convert the zeros and ones into a number.
Yeah.
Into
okay.
an integer, and so it's trying to find the most work chain, and the number of leading zeros is a proxy measure, that's usually right, but not always.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing. I don't remember when that became better understood, but there is a difference between the longest chain, which was sort of the original Bitcoin model, and the you could call it like the heaviest proof of work chain. So it's like the one that actually has the most proof of work. And yeah, it's like how low of a number can you get? So yes, it is an important distinction.
I don't know if it's important, but it's if we're going for accuracy in this paragraph, that's probably the only thing I would change. Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily important within the context here, but it's important in broadly, how does the consensus manage to work? Because a longest chain would not be enough to generate consensus. But I think that's actually outside of the scope of this particular discussion of proof of work. The procedure, remember, is totally arbitrary. It is simply an added complication, like a ritual, so as to make blocks more difficult to generate. Really, anything else would do, as long as it was computationally difficult. Other cryptocurrencies use other hash algorithms. There is no special condition for number theory, which only someone like Shinichi Mochizuki could understand. And that's a famous mathematician who's worked in that field. But yeah, I think, one of the big things, you hear this from everyone who talks about, Bitcoin, is there's a complicated math puzzle, or something like that. They make it seem like there's like really hard math problems, hard in the, like, you have to be a really smart guy standing at a board, trying to figure it out for a long time. That kind of hardness of a math problem that does mining. But it has more to do not with the hardness in conceptual difficulty, but hardness in computational difficulty. So SHA-256 is actually a completely widely available open hashing algorithm, and it's not rocket science. Anyone who wants to really dive in and understand it can go learn how it operates, and you can make your own chips. They probably won't be as fast as the ASICs that the professionals make, but all of these things are possible. But the actual, because of how that function operates, it takes a certain amount of energy to get an answer out of it. And so that is the actual important thing about the function, and I would say what makes SHA-256 probably have been a good choice is the openness of it, such that it could be very widely deployed.
Yeah, and I hear that point. I think for normies, it's like SHA-256 is a complicated math problem. So, like, if at any time, somebody's like, oh, it's really simple, I get what you mean, that it's not like trying to come up with a new mathematical proof that has never been come up with, or trying to cure cancer, which I think is another avenue people go down. But, if you tell somebody to actually, even if they're a cryptography expert, to whiteboard a SHA-256 hash, you're in for a couple of days of work. But as you point out, like, if you're actually computing it on a computer, there's lots of open source code that can do it for you, and it's basically instantaneous. It's only when you're trying to do trillions of them per second that you can slow things down. So I've encountered that phrase a lot in Bitcoin mining explainers. And I'm always tempted to, make that edit of like, oh, it's not complicated. But I actually think that calling it a complex math problem is a perfectly fine simplification, which is like literally accurate. But some people who, are too smart for their own good, they might take it in the wrong direction. But for the average person, like, it is a apt description of it's a complicated math problem combined with writing lots of raffle tickets or something like that.
Right. The metaphor that I like to use with people is flipping quarters, because it is effectively, you flip it 256 times and you have, a string of 256 ones and zeros. And, if you're trying to get a number of leading zeros, plus, like you were saying, as low of a number, that's, how many times can you flip a quarter tails? And that's something that I think you could theoretically have a network of people standing around flipping quarters to have their IRA, little Bitcoin network. And that to me is not complicated at all. But yes, like strictly speaking, any of these math functions are not, it's not something you're going to learn in high school. It's going to take, probably more of, an undergraduate, math class or cybersecurity class is where you're going to actually learn how it works. So from that perspective, it is most certainly complicated. So let's continue. Although the purpose of mining computers is to do the accounting for the blockchain, most of the work they actually do is to search for good nonces rather than anything to do with accounting. The energy used to find the nonces is lost forever. The energy does not, quote, back the value of bitcoins in the way that gold backs an honest banknote, as some have supposed. Of the vast computing power that goes into Bitcoin mining, all but a fraction is apparently purposeless. And I think, I would say that, it almost has little to do with accounting.
I mean, it literally has zero to do with accounting.
Because it has everything to do with just finding the nonces.
if you crack open a Bitcoin mining rig, like there's not a Bitcoin node inside of it that is doing any kind of verification or accounting. And so I think that that part could be removed entirely, but the rest is very good. Pointing out that the people say, oh, Bitcoin is backed by energy. That is it's true in a metaphorical sense, perhaps, just like people will say, oh, the dollar is backed by the military. But then if you look at it literally, like, is that a correct description of reality? No, not at all. The energy is a cost on the system. It's not it's not bottled up. And same thing with the military, right? The military is a giant drain on the U.S. dollar. It's undermining the U.S. dollar, if anything. So and so with mining as well, that it is diluting the value of Bitcoin, within that issuance schedule, obviously. So that's, I think, a huge problem with any kind of metaphor or loose speaking about Bitcoin, even if using that kind of phraseology does help some people wrap their minds around it.
Right. And I mean, I would say that, in some sense, mining is always a drain on the economy, but it is a cost that we take on for a reason, because if we don't take on that cost, we can't have decentralized consensus at all, in which case we're stuck with, fiat money and other suboptimal monetary technology.
Yeah. Although, I think here would be a good point to and we'll see this later on in the article, is drawing out the difference between the energy that is going into the issuance of the Bitcoin and the energy that's going into transaction fees, basically. Mm-hmm. Because it's like Bitcoin mining is dual purpose. It's to prevent monopoly seigniorage, and so it's the only decentralized way to issue the currency. And it's also part of it's also the transactional consensus. And so I think that's been a challenge as well for folks to grok, because Satoshi talks, people want us to talk about Satoshi since we're the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute. In the white paper, Satoshi makes the metaphor to gold mining specifically in the context of adding units to the ledger. He doesn't use that metaphor for any other context. And so it's kind of like a weird situation where, everyone uses the metaphor that is specific to only one half of the purpose, although it's, 98% of the actual energy consumed. And the other thing too is that gold, so when you mine gold, does the cost of mining gold back the value of gold? Well, no, it doesn't. But it's also a limiting constraint on the ability of gold miners to dilute the above the ground supply of gold. It's a little different in Bitcoin with the difficulty adjustment, but I think that there's something to be said for that too.
As far as, miners and nodes, I think this is something that, very early Bitcoin, Satoshi himself, it's like one CPU, one vote, which, you could argue is how specifically to understand what that's referring to. But there was much more of a thought that mining is the thing that's sort of like controlling Bitcoin, and nodes are kind of a thing that ultimately like miners have to do because they're the ones, quote, validating the network and so on. Whereas, now we understand that those are sort of two separate services, and you run a node because you want to know, the state of the network in relation to, yeah, and especially in relation to your own, holdings and activity. And the miners are just doing validating insofar as it's, not proprietary. For instance, like a large miner like Riot, where is a node? Is there a node to be found at all? Is it like to what degree is a node actually used by a large mining operation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a different company, right? It's the mining pool operator that is running a node. And even them, they do today, but back in the day, you would have headers only SPV mining where nobody in the mining process was running a node. And so, it's just like there's no. The only reason that a Bitcoin miner would run a node is for exactly the same reason as any other participant on the network would run a node, which is to verify their own transactions, verify that they're in consensus, and that's not unique to mining in any way.
Yeah, so the mining itself is literally searching for nonces that meet a certain requirements. They receive, hey, this is what we need as far as nonces go, so that we can basically solve this puzzle with these parameters, meaning, what the transactions were. And Riot and, other miners, they're literally just focused on getting those. And it's the, like you said, the mining pool, and then ultimately the network as a whole that then is checking the work to see if this was valid and honest.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's continue. When a person upgrades their mining computer, they mine at a faster rate and therefore earn more bitcoins. However, when everyone upgrades, the mining does not become more efficient as a whole. There is only supposed to be one new block every 10 minutes, regardless of how hard the network is working. Instead, the network updates the difficulty to require more stringent conditions for future blocks. All miners may work harder, but none is better off. It is rather like a forest in which every tree tries to grow as tall as possible so as to capture more light than its fellows, with the end result that most of the solar energy is used to grow long dead trunks. Why tie each Bitcoin block to a difficult Procrustean bed? The correct way of thinking about the proof of work concept is as a means for a group of self-interested people, none of whom is subordinate to any other, to establish a consensus against a considerable incentive to resist it. Bitcoin could operate perfectly well without proof of work as long as everyone was perfectly honest and altruistic. If they are not, then reaching a consensus is difficult. And that's kind of what I was going at earlier. And this is one of the problems of many Bitcoin critics, especially coming from the environmental viewpoint, is it's kind of this. It's like a post hoc rationalization for why they don't like Bitcoin. They say, it uses energy, but there's sort of like missing the point of, well, why is it being used in the first place? And it usually comes down to they just don't like Bitcoin. And so, yeah, we have to actually understand what it is that people like about Bitcoin to understand why they're putting all of this effort towards creating a decentralized consensus.
Yep.
Before a new block is generated, there might be many payments floating around the network, and there is not yet any objective answer as to which payment should go through. Some might be invalid, so they all need to be checked. Some might not include any transaction fees, so there also must be a decision as to whether to be nice and allow these free riders to go through, or whether to ignore them. Finally, there may be a set of 2 or more payments such that not all can be simultaneously valid, but certain subsets of it are valid. For example, one wallet might try to spend the same bitcoins twice at the same time. In that case, there is an arbitrary choice over which payments to allow. Thus, for a given set of payments, there may be many possible blocks which can be constructed from them, none of which is objectively the most correct one. There will not necessarily be any agreement over which outcome is preferable because different possible blocks will have different benefits for different people. There is, first of all, the reward that comes from generating a block of a set of new bitcoins. This is necessary because without it, there would be little incentive for anyone to do the accounting in the first place. But with a reward available, each miner naturally would prefer the new block to be his proposal rather than anyone else's. There are other more subtle complications even without considering the reward. A miner might refuse to validate transactions which come from his enemy, or he might be more or less altruistic as to what kinds of fees he will accept. He might even wish to scam someone else by double spending. In this scenario, he would send a payment to a victim in exchange for a good, but would only validate a second conflicting payment he made at the same time to another wallet which he also owns. This would make his first payment invalid, and he would therefore end up with a good that he did not pay for. With so many reasons to want to manipulate the blockchain for their own purposes, the miners might well agree in the abstract on the need for a consensus without ever agreeing on any concrete proposal. Bitcoin's solution is to add extra requirements to the protocol, which greatly increase the cost of defection. If blocks are generated randomly by a difficult computation, there will be only one proposed new block at a time. Once a new block is proposed, the miners have the choice of continuing to search for an alternative more favorable to themselves, or accepting the new proposal and searching for the next one. Everyone who accepts the latest block understands that he is following a natural consensus, and that if he is lucky enough to generate the next block, it will probably be accepted for the same reasons that he accepted the last one. On the other hand, to hold so as to try to produce a more favorable block is risky, because he would have to convince enough of the rest of the miners to go along with him that he can establish a new consensus. The general rule is that the first block mined is not self-interested because no one can plan on being first. One can only be first by luck. Any holdouts are suspect because to generate it, the miner had to make a choice to reject a perfectly good and presumably altruistic alternative. Not an easy thing to do. And one little caveat I'll throw in before I give it off to you is that you can have times where there are multiple blocks at the same time, in which case you do have to look at the weight of the proof of work to choose between them. And you can even have times where you have a reorg, where the name of the podcast comes from, where a block has gone out and been accepted, but you might just, because of how the network is, you can have times where another block does show up, and the block following it altogether has a greater proof of work, and thus you switch onto that new chain. You reorganize the chain onto that proof of work, and this happens. You could probably remember this better than I can, how often it happens, but it's not uncommon. But of course, usually we would only see about one block deep, and it would be actually concerning if you started to see reorgs that were much deeper than that.
Yeah, I think the deepest recent one would be like 3 blocks. But also, it's irrelevant for most people because the only thing that changed for is the block header, right? But their transaction ID is still the same, and so it's like, okay, they don't really care.
Yeah, this is part of why, in the white paper, he talks about 6 confirmations and everything is basically depending on the value of the transaction and what level of assurance you want that it's truly in the blockchain and just, etched in cryptographic stone, so to speak, although it's, never truly objectively, final. But the more that you want it, the more confirmations you're going to want before you get comfortable. But for most people, especially if you're, just kind of, sending smaller amounts of money around, or you just have a low time preference and you're not really eager to get into the blockchain, you don't have to be, as concerned about confirmations. So is there anything else about anything I've read that you want to point out?
No, it's all kind of, objective description of how the system works, the problem it addresses.
Yeah, so now we get into an interesting where Daniel here tries to, apply some biological concepts from evolution to kind of make sense of the process going on. So let's get into that. The handicap principle. There is an idea from biology called the handicap principle, which sheds light on this process. It says that when two animals have an incentive to cooperate, they must communicate good intentions to one another in a believable way. In order to make lying implausible, the signal must impose a cost on the signaler that would make it very costly to cheat. In other words, the signal itself must be a handicap. This can be understood in terms of the prisoner's dilemma, a famous idea from game theory which has applications to an enormous range of phenomena. The prisoner's dilemma has two players, each with two options: cooperate or defect. Ordinarily, the game is explained in terms of a story about two prisoners who each has the option of either keeping silent or ratting out the other. The essential features of the prisoner's dilemma are that each player is better off choosing to defect regardless of the other player's choice, and that the greatest benefit goes to him who defects when the other cooperates. The players might both be better off if they both cooperate rather than both defect, but since they have no way to ensure cooperation, they will both choose to defect. The handicap principle solves the problem of the prisoner's dilemma by allowing an earlier step to the game in which each player has the option of doing something that convincingly removes the benefit of defection over cooperation. It is hard to think of how to make the handicap principle work with the story of the two prisoners, but suppose they have a moment together with the prosecutor, and one of the prisoners, with a particularly good understanding of game theory, says to the prosecutor, "If the other prisoner is guilty, then I am equally guilty." This statement is a clear cost to himself because it removes his ability to defect when the other prisoner cooperates. The other prisoner then has the option of repeating the statement. If he does not, then he knows that the first prisoner's only viable option is to defect, but if he does, then both prisoners can be expected to cooperate. This is the handicap principle. The handicap principle has been applied successfully to a diverse range of biological phenomena. To give a concrete example, suppose a prey animal notices a predator stalking it. Both animals would benefit if the prey could communicate to the predator that it is no longer unaware. The predator would not want to hunt further if it had lost the element of surprise, and the prey would not be hunted. However, the prey could start randomly saying, "I see you," even when it sees no predator, just to deter any which might happen to be there. As long as the prey might be lying, the predator cannot take its signal at face value and must ignore it. Within a species, the handicap principle explains a lot about how animals compete with one another and interact with their mates. For example, among deer, the buck with the biggest antlers are the strongest and best specimens because any smaller deer who try to grow larger ones would seriously risk using more energy and nutrients on them than they can handle. Thus, second-rate bucks end up with second-rate antlers, and third-rate bucks end up with third-rate antlers, and so on. In a social species, the handicap principle explains much about ethics and altruism. Just as members of a species can differentiate themselves in strength and health with a handicap like horns or antlers, members of a social species can use altruism as a handicap to distinguish one another. For example, the handicap principle describes a social bird called the Arabian babbler that competes over altruism. The most powerful and dominant birds demonstrate their superiority by spending time on guard duty for the rest of the flock and by feeding nestlings and lower-ranking birds. Babblers do not like to be fed by other babblers of a similar rank because they do not like to feel inferior. The handicap principle even describes an observation in which one bird fed a worm to another bird only to have the same worm forced back down his own throat. Proof of work should not therefore be seen as a mysterious or wasteful system, but as something functional, natural, and potentially of value for the design of any communication protocol. If a distributed system of computers is owned by one person, he can assume that they will all cooperate because he controls their behavior. When this is not the case, there is a real need for different computers to prove that they are working toward the same goal. The universality of the handicap principle in biology should be enough to make one suspect that a protocol which does not impose costs on its users invites abuse. This is interesting to think of how many problems with the internet can be ascribed to a failure to account for this principle. If proof of work had been understood when email was invented, there might never have been a spam problem. If the internet protocol could require proof of work for client requests, we might not have to worry about distributed denial of service attacks. The Bitcoin proof of work system can be compared to both antlers and altruism. The ability to generate blocks is a show of computational strength, which is just what the Bitcoin network needs to help verify all the transactions. But it is also a show of community spirit because by agreeing to enter the contest for the next block, they show themselves to be willing to respect the interests of the community rather than manipulate the blockchain for self-interested purposes. This is just the sort of thing that should be expected to hold a community together. So that's quite a lot, and I cannot claim myself to be an expert in signaling theory or evolutionary biology. So there's only so much that I can, sort of claim one way or another as to the quality of the metaphor. But I do think it's broadly speaking a very interesting one, and I do think that costly signals is effectively exactly what proof of work is, but where there might be some quibbles has to do with who's doing the verification of the signals, like who is the signal for.
Yeah, I agree. And the email part, that was something that I think Adam Beck, tried to apply proof of work to. And I've seen also like other startups try to approach this problem of essentially paying people to read your email but even without the payment, if it was just proof of work and having the like sunk costs essentially of having generated the email, I don't think that solves the spam problem. And in fact, you could argue that for email, in that context, it actually makes it worse. That now the spammer has an incentive to be even more manipulative in their social engineering and to invest more into tricking people into, given that they're investing in the proof of work, they're going to invest more in the content of the email in order to scam this victim. And then the victim is like, well, it's like the emails I want to receive from, my grandfather, it's like, I don't care if he has a proof of work attached to it or not. And then the emails I don't want to receive from scammers trying to extract value, they have a expected value function where that's positive, right? That they think that, if they do enough proof of works, that eventually somebody will fall for their scam.
Yes. One thing, I was just doing some very brief, investigation of some of the, signaling theory just to kind of, reorient myself with this. And something that I noted is that, when you're talking about peacocks and their tails and, talking about, it's how big it is and how costly it is to make that, that tail is effectively a proxy for honesty, about, genetic quality. But one of the key things there is that a peacock, a peafowl, the female of the species has no other way to judge genetic quality. It is to them effectively a black box. They have bird brains. So the tail is just like a signal without any other mechanism. But, when we're receiving blocks on the Bitcoin network, we don't just have to accept any block just because of proof of work. Proof of work is just, that's just to get in the door. What you actually need to do is send proof of work attached to a valid block with valid transactions. And so we actually can judge the quality of a block, and the proof of work is just slightly different than that same kind of honesty. It feels like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. I think, yeah. So yeah, because like if it wasn't honest, you could still just you can inherently reject it regardless of cost. This is there's the fortress of what is the impenetrable fortress of validation.
Yeah.
You're not getting in to the network if you have even one thing wrong that anyone notices, because they're not going to relay the block. A different way of kind of thinking about this that came to my mind, it still goes along with this signaling theory, is imagining in a sort of biological sense, if you had two deers who were wanting to fight each other over a mate, and they just like show up and they're able to look at each other and see which one has the biggest antlers. You can just be like, oh, there's a way in which it's like you don't even have to fight, because you've already done the proxy fight by showing, well, you're probably stronger because you have bigger antlers. Therefore, you had more, capacity to generate sort of excess and make that signal. So you've already signaled enough to show that you're the winner in this round. And with Bitcoin mining, it's like, okay, then you go saw off your antlers, and then every 10 minutes, any deer can now show up, any new deer, and they can, it's just this constant renewal of like who has the biggest antlers. And it's a way to sort of have the fight without having a fight, because as soon as you see someone showed up with bigger antlers, it's better to just move on to the next one and focus on the next round than trying to beat them at that already finished round.
Yeah, and I think that reflects the most work chain pretty well.
Yeah. So overall, I do think that's very interesting, but specifically the fact that validation is sort of separate from mining adds a little bit of a wrinkle, I think. But like I said, I am no expert in this field, so this is something if someone might have a stronger position.
I've explained Bitcoin mining quite a few times over the past 3 years at least, and I've never felt the need to resort to a biological metaphor. Like, you can just explain it of like, yeah, if they propose an invalid block, like they don't get any revenue, but they still put in all this cost into doing it, and so that's why nobody does it.
Yeah, I don't think that this is the metaphor that people ought to use to go speak to new people. In particular,
I'm anti-metaphor now. I feel like metaphors are not good. They tend to muddy the waters more than, and it's like it's a crutch of like, you can't explain it simply, and so now you have to resort to a metaphor, and so it's a cop-out, I think.
In this case, Daniel is very knowledgeable in evolutionary biology, so as a natural interest of his to want to cast it in these terms.
Notice more widely is like anybody who comes to Bitcoin, like if their background is real estate, they're gonna think about Bitcoin as real estate, right? Like they map on as a metaphor onto Bitcoin what their greatest interests are. Thankfully, my greatest interest before Bitcoin was accounting, and so there wasn't really like a problem there, I think, and sound money. And so it's like, okay, well, that maps on without, you don't need a translation layer. It's not a metaphor. It's a literal description of what the system is. But the worst situation is when somebody's like, my background is in medical records, and so now I'm going to figure out how to use blockchain technology for medical records. They don't even like engage in a metaphor. They decide to like literally create what they want.
Right. Yeah, someone I'm thinking Stefan Kinsella is very anti-metaphor, and very, very much for this reason. For him, obviously, his primary focus over the years has been intellectual property, and his argument is often that the people making arguments for intellectual property are effectively using improper metaphors at their core to do that, and that's just wrong. So they in that case the metaphor is that when you are homesteading, you're mixing your labor with something, and so it's like, oh, you had to like work to make the idea, therefore it's yours. Whereas he would argue that it has more to do with how action creates, a barrier and so on and so forth. But the point being is a metaphor can have long-term consequences in terms of getting things right, because a metaphor is naturally imperfect, and so it's always important to to go back and if you were using a metaphor, like here, go back and see to what extent was the metaphor actually even necessary, and also insofar as it may or may not have helped, where does it fall short, so that you can be quite honest about the limitations of it, so you don't get caught up into the future. I want to get back to the comment you had about the spam problem, but I think that would better fit after this next section, so I'm going to read that first. Bitmessage. A more recent application of proof of work is Bitmessage, which is an anonymous distributed encrypted message protocol which could one day be almost as important as Bitcoin. It was inspired by Bitcoin, but it works quite differently. There is no blockchain in the Bitmessage protocol because there is no need to store all messages forever in a database. Instead, Bitmessage requires everyone who sends a message to perform some work before the network will relay it. This ensures that every message will be meaningful. No spammer could afford to let his computer run for a minute or so for every message he sends. Proof of work is essential because a distributed network that relies on computation donated by its users cannot afford to allow free riders. It is in its early stages presently, and it has not yet been studied sufficiently to be considered secure, but it has enormous potential as an alternative to email. And first, I would say, this is 2013. I remember playing with Bitmessage. I remember actually, having my short-term excitement about Bitmessage. But this goes to show that it can be very dangerous to get super excited by any particular technology without enough, the fundamentals, because this is something that today most people have probably not even heard of. So to be saying that it could one day be almost as important as Bitcoin clearly has not held the test of time. And I think there's a couple things. I don't want to get too much into Bitmessage in particular. I want to get more back to what you were saying about the spam problem. And I think one thing there is in some sense you could see that it's like a misapplication of the or a miscategorization of what the problem is, which is it tends to be more of a social problem than a pure cost problem. We don't expect our friends to have to I wouldn't make you attach proof of work just to get a message to me. It's just like you can just contact me directly and I'll open it up. It's always someone who's outside of your network in some way that you have these suspicions about. And the way to solve that might less be about just a raw computational number, which can be produced as long as it's all about just how much do they care about you seeing the message, more so than how much do they care about you ascertaining some new truth thanks to them, because they might be lying to you. It's something where you would actually probably do a better job if you were able to demonstrate some actual real social connection to them. So it's like, I'm a friend of a friend, here's an introduction. It's always great to get introductions from people. Or, demonstrating some actual, thing they can see that shows that you have credibility in having a set of knowledge that you're about to present. So it's like, oh yeah, I saw you give a talk at a conference. That gives you a sort of credibility. I think scammers actually use that same technique to get their feet in the door of, being like conference hoppers and like just saying words at conferences, and then people think that they're important or something. But it seems much more of a social problem, and sort of a web of trust type issue, more so than a thing that raw numbers are going to overcome.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, if we look at the growth of Bitmessage versus the growth of Nostr, it becomes clear what has better product market fit in terms of messaging. And so there's lots of ways to handle this issue that is not proof of work. And I think that at the end of the day, what we might find is that the only real use case for proof of work was Bitcoin.
Right. Just in the same way that a blockchain narrowly defined is pretty much also just for Bitcoin. It is Bitcoin is the underlying technology for blockchain technology. which we will also get to in future articles that we look to. So here's the last section, and this one's interesting because it's 2013. We'll get to that. So PP coin and proof of stake. A discussion of proof of work would not be complete without a discussion of PP coin, the third most popular cryptocurrency after Bitcoin and Litecoin. PP coin also uses proof of work so as to make defection unprofitable, but the costs are distributed very differently among the miners. Those miners who have held a lot of PP coin for a long time suffer much less stringent requirements for producing a block than those who have held few PP coin and who have held them for a shorter time. This means that people will not tend to follow the consensus proposed by the person with the most powerful computer, but rather the person who has demonstrated the greatest investment in the currency. Miners are distinguished by something more like seniority than strength. When a miner creates a new block in the PP coin blockchain, he has to trade in some of his old coins to get the new ones, meaning that everyone who creates a block is less able to create the next one. This system is called proof of stake. Proof of work and proof of stake have different costs and benefits under different circumstances. According to the handicap principle, the cost imposed to produce a signal must be related to the meaning of the message. A proof of stake system demonstrates investment in the coin itself, whereas a proof of work system in the underlying network. Thus, if there were a proof of work network and a proof of stake network, which both had the same market cap, one would therefore expect that the proof of work coin to have a bigger network with a higher capacity and to be more liquid than the proof of stake network, whereas the proof of coin would have the greater price stability. The proof of work system discourages an antisocial miner from manipulating the blockchain by making it difficult to rely consistently on the network to accept his blocks. The proof of stake system, by contrast, discourages antisocial miners by accepting only blocks from miners who have an incentive to ensure that the commodity remains absolutely trustworthy. Because the proof of stake is used up as new blocks are generated, there is continual turnover in who is able to mine, and thus less incentive to specialize in maintaining the blockchain. In its early stages, a cryptocurrency network requires long-term investment in the coin itself so as to gain credibility and value, whereas a larger, more mature network would be more likely to require specialization in the network infrastructure to ensure that it functioned properly. This is an academic discussion. It is counterproductive to back any cryptocurrency other than Bitcoin. It is not to be expected that ordinary consumers would choose one currency over another because It is not to be expected that ordinary consumers would choose one currency over another because of obscure technical details that do not affect their use for it as a currency. They will be much more likely to choose whichever is more widely accepted. Someone who thinks PP coin is more rational has little expectation of PP coin beating Bitcoin, but he might have a chance of convincing the Bitcoin community to adapt a proof of stake system in some future version of Bitcoin. Although this is theoretically possible and might have benefits, the Bitcoin miners already formed a vested interest in the present system and would therefore tend to oppose such an innovation. So there is a lot there right off the bat. First of all, PP coin, terrible name. And they realized that later. They changed it to Pierre coin. But it's funny, third most popular cryptocurrency after Bitcoin and Litecoin. So this is just, I'm guessing that most listeners do not remember PP coin or Pierre coin. And so yet another example of altcoins going to the graveyard. This is interesting to me just because this was the first proof of stake coin, and I think Daniel makes some interesting arguments here. But what's interesting is this was actually before what I think some of the strongest arguments with regards to the nothing at stake problem, where yes, you can put coins up for the stake, but you can do that for multiple chains at a time. And so you're not, in any given round of the game, you're never really truly locked in to a particular choice, which means that it's not actually as costly of a signal. It's not
costly at all.
Right. It's only costly insofar as were you able to. Yes, actually. So the signal itself is not costly. The only costly thing is actually getting the coins to be able to make the costless signal with. So this was sort of a much earlier argument. And, I think it's interesting. Since then, there's been so many variations on proof of stake that people have gone through. And we've also witnessed the second largest coin, which didn't even exist at the time of this article, Ethereum, moved to proof of stake. And it's not had good economic prospects since. And in fact, I don't even think it's held up its monetary properties in the way that it was claimed that proof of stake would allow it to do.
Yeah, and as Daniel points out, it's like the end user does not care. So, to the extent that it just creates an incentive to not like that you have to like put your coins to work. It's a feature for the normal person that they can't just put things in cold storage and then turn off their node and then come back 10 years later, turn on their node and be able to rejoin, in with the same assurances as when they left.
And then for miners also, the risks of having to sit with a hot wallet. It's like if you have more and more investment in this, let's imagine that one of these coins does grow larger. That means you're going to have to put a larger and larger pool of economic resources at a security risk for the purposes of trying to continue the network. Whereas miners can keep their addresses, the payout addresses, completely in cold storage and not have to be concerned with that, and just be focused on the only thing being online is a network of computers that's going through as many hashes as possible.
Yeah, and I think that's essentially the argument that I've seen to be most effective is that if the proof of stake coins get stolen, the only way to fix it is to do a hard fork. Whereas if the hash rate gets hijacked, you have a physical connection to the real world where you can flip an electrical switch and reclaim the hash rate. And so just from a cybersecurity perspective, like the proof of stake it requires you to do a hard fork, whereas Bitcoin mining does not.
Yes, I would recommend to readers, if they want to get into some of the later arguments around proof of stake and decentralized consensus, I highly recommend On Stake and Consensus by Andrew Polstra, which is available in the SNI library, where he tries to make a very technical argument as to things like the nothing at stake problem and why proof of work specifically is able to generate decentralized consensus, but also why it was sort of believed that proof of stake would just never quite work in the way they want, no matter how many, kind of interesting bells and whistles or epicycles or whatever they want to add on to it. It never quite lives up to what proof of work is able to do with a rather elegant simplicity.
Yeah, that's right.
So is there anything else that you think is relevant to the proof of work discussion?
No, I think that we covered a lot today.
Yeah, I think this. It's interesting looking back. I think this is one of the great things about why I'm excited about doing this podcast is being able to revisit this and just see. So, for instance, today we learned is maybe you want to be careful with metaphors when you're talking about Bitcoin or maybe anything else, because of the confusion that it can cause, and also if it's tailored at the wrong people, it might just be a total dud. And so perhaps instead we should just be looking for very simple and straightforward ways to be able to describe what proof of work is and why it's needed, and how it works, rather than going too hard trying to come up with like clever metaphors. That being said, the metaphor at hand is very interesting, and for those who are interested in evolutionary biology and signaling theory, I'm sure it's of great interest. So, yeah, well, this has been another episode of the Reorg brought to you by the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute. The Satoshi Nakamoto Institute relies on contributions from the community to keep doing what we do. So, help us out, help yourself out, help your friends out by, studying, sending links to your friends and family to learn more about Bitcoin, and if you want us to be able to continue doing this in a big way, consider sending a very costly signal of hard-earned Satoshis that, we can use to help power the website and grow our operations and do more education so that we can take these ideas and make sure that they survive even more years of cumulative proof of work. So we don't have to reorg our beliefs in Bitcoin too much into the future. We want to have the strongest, most timeless understanding of Bitcoin that we can have so we can pass that down to our children and their children and so on, and be able to have generational knowledge for generational wealth. So you can visit our website to study up and to get involved and to donate, and I recommend you do so. We are available on all the podcasting networks now. If there is a podcast network that you like to use that we're not showing up on, please let me know. We are available on Apple and Spotify, but also a Bitcoin favorite fountain. And we're also available on X, YouTube, Nostr, and Rumble. So wherever you'd like to find us, come find us and visit the Nakamoto Institute at nakamotoinstitute.org. And we will see you next time to continue discussing the SNI mempool. Thank you for joining, Pierre.
Thank you.